Hello, my name is Ryan Joe Robago. The topic of my essay and presentation will be the U.S. colonization of the Philippines. The presentation and essay will be divided into four parts: the Spanish-American War, the Philippine-American War, colonial development in the Philippines, and independence/closing thoughts. My thesis statement is the occupation of the Philippines acts as a blueprint to modern American imperialism. I'll preface this presentation by giving general information about the Philippines to better understand the Philippines in a geographical context. The Philippines is a Southeast Asian country comprised of many islands, also known as an archipelago. It has a population of more than 109 million people. The official languages is English and Filipino, which is standardized Tagalog. The main religion is Christianity, and its capital is Manila. The Philippines has been ruled by the Spanish Empire for more than 300 years, from 1521 to 1898. Furthermore, the Philippines has also been subjected to colonial rule by the Americans from 1898 to 1946 for almost 50 years. The Spanish-American War was a relatively short war lasting slightly more than 3 months. Spain at the turn of the century was a declining empire. Thus, its overseas territories of Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines were at risk of being liberated or controlled by foreign powers. Being a far distant island in the Pacific, the question on what to do with the Philippines was met with vigorous debate. Having successfully expanded westward in the United States, the idea of manifest destiny was popular and supported by many in government, including the president of the time, William McKinley. William McKinley viewed himself and the Americans not as colonial exploitative powers seen in Europe, but rather as virtuous liberators. In a 1900 speech, President William McKinley has been quoted as saying that we could not give them back to Spain, that would be cowardly and dishonorable, that we could not turn them over to France or Germany, our commercial rivals in the Orient, that would be bad business and discreditable, that we could not leave them to themselves, they were unfit for self-government, and they would soon have anarchy and misrule worse than Spain's was, and that there was nothing left for us to do but to take them all and to educate the Filipinos and uplift and civilize and Christianitize them, and by God's grace do the very best we could by them, as our fellow men for whom Christ also died. This sentiment was also shared by others in government. Secretary of War Elihu Root was quoted as saying, "There is no Philippine people, but rather more than 80 different tribes, speaking more than 60 different languages, occupying hundreds of islands." On the other side of opinion, there was also resistance to the idea of Philippine annexation. In 1898, the American Anti-Imperialist League was established to stand as opposition to the American annexation of the Philippines. Prominent members include industrialist Andrew Carnegie and writer Mark Twain. Mark Twain famously wrote a satirical piece titled "To the Person Sitting in Darkness," which critiqued American imperialism. Andrew Carnegie, a billionaire at the time, even offered the American government $20 million in exchange for Filipino independence. Unfortunately, anti-American imperialists were unsuccessful in preventing the annexation of the Philippines. In August 1898, the Battle of Manila took place, also known as the Mock Battle of Manila. This was known as a mock battle because it was secretly staged by the government of the United States and Spain. Spain had secretly capitulated to giving up the Philippines to the United States, while the Filipinos themselves were not allowed to participate in the battle. Spain had been a dying empire at the time and on the verge of losing its overseas territories, but they could still not accept a defeat of losing to the Filipinos, and thus secretly agreed with the Americans that they would lose the battle and the war, and territory be given to the United States for a sum of $20 million in exchange. The United States was then granted sovereignty over the Philippines through the signage of the Treaty of Paris in 1898. To the dismay of the Filipinos, who had just endured colonial overseership by the Spanish Empire for more than 300 years, they were once again subjected to another colonial power, this time the United States. The Spanish-American War was only 3 months, but it would soon be followed by the Philippine-American War, in which the Filipinos resisted for more than 3 years until their defeat in 1902. The following war was brutal, resulting in the death of more than 100,000 Filipinos. The Americans were accused of torture. They utilized one form of torture known as the water cure, in which the victim is forced to swallow large amounts of water. Just until they are about to pass out or drown, they would be punched in the stomach and forced to vomit. One particular soldier, American Jacob H. Smith, during military operations in Samar, he reportedly ordered his battalion to kill everybody over the age of 10 years old. The Americans, having the economic and military advantage, defeated the Filipinos in both conventional and guerrilla war. Achieving victory, the Philippine government was then dissolved by American powers. Years later, in 1916 and 1934, the Jones Act and the following 1934 Tydings-McDuffie Act were passed, outlining plans for eventual Philippine independence in the years to come after. Under American rule, President William McKinley pursued a policy of benevolent assimilation, in which he has been quoted as saying, "Finally, it should be the earnest wish and paramount aim of the military administration to win the confidence, respect, and affection of the inhabitants of the Philippines by assuring them in every possible way the full measure of individual rights and liberties, which is the heritage of free peoples, and by providing to them the mission of the United States is one of substituting the mild sway of justice and the rights of arbitrary rule." Trade relations were then established between the United States and the Philippines. The Payne-Aldrich Act was passed, which eliminated tariffs between the United States and the Philippines. However, some of the Philippines' biggest exports, such as rice, sugar, and tobacco, were still subject to tariffs as a way of protecting American producers. Otherwise, the United States and the Philippines saw the free movement of goods in both directions. Because of the unincorporated status of the Philippines, the Filipinos, despite being under American rule, were not afforded the same rights as mainland Americans. They could not vote or freely migrate to America. Despite these many setbacks, there were many advancements made in the Philippines. The greatest contribution to the Philippine society was arguably the American school system. As a way of diplomatic partnership, the Pensionado Act was passed, in which Filipino applicants were chosen to study abroad in the United States. For better or for worse, this policy helped Americanize young Filipino students and demonstrate U.S. benevolence towards the Philippines. Filipinos, in turn, were more willing to adopt American customs and dress. In the Philippines, the United States established universities all throughout the country and hired American teachers to teach in the Philippines. One of the most prestigious universities in the Philippines, Silliman University, was established by the Americans in 1901. Aside from the establishment of universities throughout the country, the greatest contribution in the educational sector is the teaching of English. The United States had employed hundreds of teachers from the United States to the Philippines. They were known as Thomasites. Lessons were taught in English, and consequently, English was adopted as one of the official languages of the Philippines. The United States did promise the Philippines eventual independence to be granted to the Filipinos under the supposition that they are ready to self-govern. However, with this, the United States inadvertently instilled a sense of colonial mentality into the people, which is, I quote, a peculiar condition of mind and soul, a signal manifestation of getting lost and not knowing who we are, where we are going, and what there really is for you, a cultural variety of Alzheimer's disease. And is an intellectual captivity where people developed a warped sense of values and a distorted picture of their own reality. This results in a lack of ethnic pride and produces a cultural inferiority complex towards colonizers, unquote. The Americans, even with good intentions, held prejudiced beliefs and saw themselves as superior. Thus, Americans encouraged Filipinos not to wear traditional American attire, to not raise debate on Filipino independence, to reject historic customs, and embrace modernity. Following invasion and occupation of Japan in World War II, the Philippines was once again, quote, liberated by the Americans. The Philippines would then go on to be granted independence the same day as the United States, ironically, July 4th, 1946. The foreign policy in the Philippines was seen as a success by the United States and was soon to be replicated throughout the world. Following World War II, Germany, for example, was rebuilt by President Truman with the goal of introducing democracy and paving the way for eventual independence. The United States also offered a helping hand in the establishment of the modern states of South Korea and Japan. However, the policy of nation building and occupation in foreign countries has also seen failures, quite notably Vietnam and countries in the Middle East. The legacy of American expansionism, particularly that derived from the Spanish-American War, continues to this day, as the United States still maintains sovereignty over Puerto Rico and Guam, U.S. territories which debate on whether to seek independence or are admitted into the Union as a state. As for the Philippines, many Filipinos hold generally favorable views on the United States. The two countries hold historical ties, and the impacts of American colonialism and influence still exist to this day. One example being the mass hiring of Filipino nurses in the United States as a result of the establishment of the American education system during its colonial era. With that said, colonialism and imperialism are in the gray area of morality. It is immoral for foreign powers to subject people to their rules without consent. But at the same time, many developments and advancements, whether political, social, or economic, can be made to the receiving territory.